All right.
Yeah, I'll slap you.
Punch me. I told Rory that this weekend, if either of us mentions work, the other has the permission to punch the other one in the face at the Widespread Panic
concert.
We're
going to 3 nights of Widespread Panic. Okay. They're playing in Napa. We've had these tickets for like 3 years. They got canceled twice for COVID.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and we always seem to end up like late night schwilly, like something about work comes up, and then it's just this like fucking conversation back and forth.
All right, well, I'll watch out for black eyes next week.
We're committed. I asked him though. He said if anybody comes up and talks about work, they get punched in the face. So I asked him if I was allowed to whisper to people that Nick really wants to talk about work, and then just stand back with popcorn.
Ask him about kind LED spectrum.
Yeah, right in the middle of fucking pigeons.
Yeah. Nick really is anxious to share his thoughts on the state of the industry.
Right when JB drops into the diner raft, like that's when you hit him with the spectrum conversation, because he's not listening to what's going on.
He'll be like this when that happens.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Grow Strong podcast. This is episode number 4. And in this episode, we're going to get into a subject that really was the premise of starting our original company, which was Super Closet, which is how to maximize your yield in small spaces. And I think it's something that is a little bit of a misnomer. A lot of people think that you need a big space and a big grow room to pull big harvests, but you really don't. As long as you know what you're doing and what techniques to use, know what strain you're growing with, you can really get a lot of biomass out of a really small space.
Yeah, absolutely. There's some best practices, and there's some common pitfalls that people seem to fall into. I've fallen into some of those myself in my earlier years growing, but I've mentioned a few times I dedicate a very small space to growing right now, and it produces more than enough to meet my needs. So today we're going to talk about the best ways to do that. Yeah, so first, let's actually talk about small spaces.
Yeah.
When we talk about small spaces in people's homes, like what are the types of things people are trying to grow in?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen people grow in everything from a closet. I've seen pictures of people growing in dumbwaiters. Have you heard those things that go from floor to floor? I've seen people grow in dumbwaiters before.
I've always wanted one of those.
For us, we've been in this all-in-one grow cabinet business for a really long time, right? And when we started that was the idea of being able to take people who either have roommates and they need to confine their grow to their bedroom. Sometimes that bedroom's super small, so we have something as small as the super box, which is a really tiny unit. Sometimes they're using those same cabinets in their garage that's packed full of stuff already, right? And they just need to carve out one little corner for their grow.
Yep.
So, small spaces come in all shapes and sizes. At Kind LED, we've kind of tailored some of that X series light to those spaces, right? That's why we have some of those real small units that you can put in a closet and that you could put in, even if you converted one of your cabinets into, a grow space like our metal cabinets are. And so, small spaces come in all shapes and sizes, and they can be very small, like that super box with one tiny Superponic 8 reservoir and a couple bar lights, and you can still get good yield out of that. You can definitely get enough for your own personal medicine. Or a small space could be considered even like our deluxe cabinet, right?
Sure.
So, they come in all shapes and sizes.
Yeah, and what are the critical features that small space has to have? Because there's a lot of DIYers out there as well, and they'll take a filing cabinet or something like that, even just put together a box and they'll grow in it. So what are the essential attributes of a contained space in order to have a successful grow?
It's the same things it is for a big space, right? Yeah. Just on a miniature scale, right? I mean, all successful grow rooms have the same attributes, which is adequate light, obviously, right? Good airflow. In two different ways, right? Air being refreshed into the room, or if it's in a closed loop type system, which you usually don't see in small spaces, but something that's keeping temperature, humidity, and CO2 at levels that the plants want, right? So that's kind of like either refreshing the air and or adding those components or taking away those components in the air to create that. And then the second one is actual airflow, right? Which is basically mimicking wind in nature.
Yeah.
It's, getting the stale air off from around those leaves and keeping those stomata flowing and open so that the plant can breathe, keeping things like pathogens and mold spores and everything else moving so that they can't really take root, and also, disrupting bugs cycle, right? When there's big gusts of wind, bugs don't like that, and so it can keep those at bay too, and can also, bring structure to the plant and give it more strong, branching and, and stems. So, so that's super important. A medium of some sort, right? So it's either going to be pots or it's going to be a hydroponic system, and that's where your plant is going to live and take root and soak up its nutrients and its water. So you're going to need one of those. You're going to need some kind of way of probably controlling smell. Which will be a carbon filter, right? So all of these things that you would normally have in a big room, just on a miniature scale.
Yeah.
And so that can become challenging, right? Fitting all of these things into a small space to where they all work together, and basically kind of stay out of the way, as it were, so you can give your plants enough room to grow.
Yeah.
And that's the whole basis of why we started Super Closet, right?
Sure.
Was to create these systems that are super sleek and have all of these attributes to them already made, already formed.
It's a ready-made, optimized environment.
Yeah, we've taken the guesswork out of it, right? We've figured it all out. We know where all those components go. They all kind of have their space, and it allows for that small space to still have a good growth chamber, which is what you are ultimately looking for, is in a small space, getting as much as you can for the plants to do their thing.
Right. Yeah. So, if you are planning on putting your own space together, you have the spot in your mind where you want to put this, and each one of those locations can represent its own challenges, making any one of these attributes Nick was just talking about a little bit more difficult. So make sure you consider all that stuff out of the gate, right? Like if you're growing in an attic, maybe it's hotter up there, right? So temperature control is going to be of paramount importance. Basements tend to be dank, and in some scenarios they could be dank
in a bad way.
Not ganja dank, more dank, like moist, right? Which represents its own challenges. You're going to be much more susceptible to molds and things like that. And so having, a way to dehumidify the air and things like that might be more important in that environment. A closet, airflow is a big challenge, right? Because that really is a contained space, and most closets don't really have that, built into the design, into the space, right?
Yeah.
So depending on where you're going to be, you just want to make sure that you're considering all of these things out of the gate.
Yep. Yeah, and then, outside of space and where you're going to put this small space and all the components that need to go into it, which later in this podcast we are going to go in front of some of our products. One a 5x5 super room, the other's a super flower. And we're going to kind of show you guys, piece by piece, like what the components are to make up a grow room of that size, and kind of like how we got around some of the challenges of growing in that small space. And so you'll be able to see it firsthand. But the next thing that I kind of think of outside of that is, kind of based in the plant, right? What strain you're going to grow in that small space, because there's a lot of strains that just aren't suited for small spaces. Just, genetically, they're just not suited for a small space.
Yeah, we all have our preferences, right? Because each of these different types of the plants have their own attributes, and some are going to be more uplifting and active, and others are going to be more pain relieving, relaxing. And so we, good for different types of medicines. And so, you may have what you like to consume, but it may not be the best if your goal is to optimize that yield in a small space. Of course, if we talk about sativas, they tend to elongate more, they grow taller, they're stretchier plants. So that they kind of represent challenges when you're growing in a tight space. You compare that against indicas that are naturally bushier and stockier and tend to stay lower to the ground.
Yeah.
So it makes them a little bit more of an appropriate candidate. Although in this day and age, there's so many hybrids out there, so it's really just kind of looking at the attributes of what you would like to grow, or finding one that will work very well in your space and also matches the attributes, characteristics that you're looking for in the plant. One thing that I would really suggest not doing, and I've done this many times myself, is, it's making decisions is hard, and you have a lot of different types of strains that you like, but mixing strains in the same tight space can be really problematic. Meaning if you've got your sativa that you really like and you're growing it next to an indica, if those plants have different growth characteristics, different times to maturation, then you are just making a lot of problems for yourself.
Yeah, it can be a challenge even in a full-size room, right? Growing multiple strains that have very different characteristics and timing, like you said, and everything else. Although it's much more easy in a bigger space because you can separate them and they all have their own zone. I can't tell you how many times our customer service department has talked to super closet customers that call in kind of freaking out because they did just that, right? Hey, what strain are you growing? And they're like, oh, I've got 4 different ones.
Yep.
And there's, one on each corner, and this one's growing too tall and shading this one. And it's just like, yeah. So in a small space, yeah, having just one strain that's all going to grow the same height, it's going to have the same flowering pattern, it's going to have the same stretch pattern, all that kind of stuff is super, super important. And then, it might take you a time or two if you're a new grower to find a strain that actually kind of reacts the way you want it to in terms of any kind of training that you do on the plant, which we'll get into here in a minute, or how much that plant actually stretches after you put it into flowering, because every plant kind of has different characteristics in that regard. One that can possibly even be flipped at a younger age. I have seen strains that when you flip them at too young of an age, they just don't really produce. And then I've seen some that you can flip literally from a clone and they grow these big, huge, beautiful flowers, right? So it's finding a strain that is kind of built for that smaller space configuration. And then it's probably going to take you, I don't want to make it sound like you can just knock it out of the park the first time around. It might take you a time or two really paying attention to what that strain did, as you're growing it, to really dial it in to maximize what you're getting out of that space.
Yeah, there's so many great strains out there, and it's very tempting to just try something different every time, but all of the best growers are the best growers because they have this massive familiarity with the strains that they grow with, and they've got it so dialed in. So that trial and error is really a necessary.
And everyone is so different. Not only from like when you can flip it into flower, how it acts to high stress, low stress training, nutrient strength, when you feed it. There's some strains out there that are nitpicky as can be, and there's some strains out there that just can take anything. Yeah. Right. And so, and it's like, there's also, picking a high yielding strain that's got really big, huge, heavy flowers for a small space might not be the best. It might not be the best. You might, and that it depends on how well your environment is controlled. In a super closet, you can pretty much dial in that environment however you want, just because of the strength of the fans and just the way they're set up and the airflow that we put in those cabinets. But if you don't have the best airflow, you probably don't want to be growing a big, huge, chunky strain. You'll probably have problems later in flowering. And so it's choosing almost kind of like what is perfect for your space.
Right. Okay. So now we've got our space picked out, and within that we want to actually maximize the amount of space we have to grow in. So what are some ways to do that?
Yeah. So you're dealing with two directions here. You're dealing with outward direction and filling that space with as much canopy and as much flower as you possibly can. And then you're also dealing with height, right? So let's jump into height first. And again, one of the first challenges I always hear of people growing in small spaces is that they don't choose when to flip their plants into flowering.
My plants grew into my light. What do I do?
Yeah.
A lot. Early growth time and extend the roof.
It's one of those teaching moments when you first start growing. A lot of people think that they want to get their plant to the height that they think it should be at through the whole cycle and then flip it into flowering, right? Oh, the plant's like at a perfect height from the light. Now I'm going to flip it into flowering. Not realizing that the first 2 to 3 weeks after changing to a 12-12 schedule for photo period specific strains, that it's going to stretch probably 2 to maybe even 3 times.
Up to 3 times.
The size that you're already at. So if you've got a plant that's a foot tall, it's going to end up at 2, maybe even 3 feet tall.
Yeah, I mean, even if you're aware of that, it's still the tendency to underestimate it is high.
Yeah.
Because it's remarkable how much more they continue to grow once you flip them into flower.
Well, and the problem is when you're in a small space, every single day of growth counts.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you're talking about a plant that can grow a few inches or more per day. And so it's like, if you're like, oh, I need to do a reservoir change to switch to flowering nutrients, or, oh, I wanted to do a, spray on the leaves before I switch to flower, whatever it might be. And so you put it off a day or two, that day or two could have been the critical point at which you just let them grow too tall and now they're creeping into the light. So you really, really, really have to be stringent and know the day that you're going to throw those things into flower. And you have to look for some signs that they're ready for that too. And this kind of goes back to that strain choice. You have to make sure that you're seeing signs of pre-flowering on that plant to know that it's matured to the point that it's going to do well in flower. Again, some strains I've seen, if they have a week or two of veg, they don't perform well. If they have 3, 4, 5 weeks of veg, they're amazing strains. Mm-hmm. On the flip side of that, I've seen strains that are, from clone, you can flip them and they create these big, awesome, nice single nug plants. And so it's really knowing your strain, knowing that it can take, a smaller amount of veg, or if it can't, maybe you can do some training techniques, again, which we'll get into here in a sec, to kind of, keep it down a little bit lower until it's like, okay, now it's ready and now I can flip it. Yep. And you still have that vertical space above to kind of take care of that stretch.
So what are some of these signs of pre-flower for folks that don't know?
Yeah, so I mean, in pre-flowering, it's pretty straightforward. You're always going to see right at the crux of where a branch will come out of the main stem, you're going to see a calyx pop up out of that. And it's going to look exactly like what you would see in full flowering stage, which is a calyx and a brax coming out of that. So the 2 little hairs that pop up out of that calyx, you're going to see that, and it's going to be a single sac, sometimes 2, right at the base of each one of those branches.
Yep.
And so once you see that, that's a sure sign that you're ready to go into flower.
Nice. One of the other things that could help is having a low profile light as well, right? I mean, you really want to have as many photons as you can, hitting the plants in that tight space, but taking up as little space, right? And so LED is great for that. I mean, when we started doing this, the lights that actually made it very challenging to grow in a tight space, because you're talking high pressure sodium lights. They have a big hood, takes up a lot of vertical space. You need ducting on both sides to keep it at a comfortable temperature, and keeping the temperature down in that space, even with all that stuff going, was like really difficult, so it almost made it a non-starter. Nowadays, with LED technology that runs a lot cooler, it makes it easier to kind of manage that temperature in a very small space. But if you look at the kind LED grow lights, I mean, you're talking an inch and a quarter on the vertical dimension, right? So it's taking up no space at all. So just having the right light can really help you maximize what you have there.
Yeah, I mean, LEDs revolutionized small space growing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, high pressure sodium, all the things that you said, managing heat and all that. But I mean, even the distance that you could get it from the plant was still 2 feet, maybe 1.5 if you're lucky, and that's with an air-cooled fixture, right?
Yeah.
It's just those. I mean, it was a bulb of burning gas. It's really hard to get that close to a living plant, And not only that, but it's hard to get that from the ceiling in a safe manner. With LEDs now, I mean, they're running so cool that you can get that thing nearly right next to the ceiling. I mean, I still would caution having some space to let those heat sinks do their work, but you can kind of get them right up against the ceiling, and there's no safety issues. And then, same thing underneath the light, you can get that plant probably within 6 inches. You got to have all your inputs pretty good if you're going to get it that close, because it's going to be a lot of light. Thankfully enough, Our LEDs, you can dim down. So if you do make the mistake of getting too close to the light, you can actually dim it down a little bit
and
to
save the harvest.
And save the harvest and keep things safe, right?
Not exactly what you want to do, but you can. It's better than having the whole thing fried.
Yeah, and again, if you get 6 inches from that light and everything else is dialed, your temperature's dialed, your humidity's dialed, your water content, your EC, all of that stuff is in good safe range, CO2, you can get it within 6 inches and it's still going to soak up every one of those photons and love it.
Yeah.
And love it, you know?
I mean,
and so small spaces with LEDs, I mean, it's a whole new ball game.
Yeah, the profile. I mean, there's so much to love about the new X series. But when I got that home and put it in my Superstar, I mean, that was one of the things I loved the most, because it opened up so much more growing space than even the K series, the K3 series that I had before that.
Yeah.
So pretty crucial. You know, you need to look at the recommended hanging height, and we just said about 6 inches. And then when the plant is about a third of the overall space, I mean, I know it's very strain dependent, but if you really want to make sure that you're safe on your first go with the new strain, you're really kind of looking at a veg that's about a third of the height of your overall grow space.
I mean, I think you might be pushing it really even at that.
Really?
Right? Yeah. I mean, if you're looking at a 2 to 3 times stretch, if you get it a third of the space, you might be up against that light by the end of it, right? You know, and so, yeah, I mean, if you've got 3 feet of space from, you know, the current plant canopy to the light, you know, you probably want to throw it in like it's 8 inches, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, 8 inches ish, right? And then you're going to, you know, grow 16, 24. You're still going to have a foot of like air room in there. And so, and again, you know, a lot of times it is trial and error, because a lot of times when you get a new strain, you don't know how it's going to stretch. I think it's one thing on the internet that we could really get better at, is having kind of this, you know, encyclopedia of strains and how they react. I mean, there's some good ones out there. Leafly's pretty good. There's a couple other ones, but like a lot of times you'll look up a strain and the information that you see about it, it's not that great from a growing standpoint, right?
Yeah.
You look up the strain and there's all sorts of things about, you know, the head high and how, you know, like all, you know, the smoking effects of it, but you really don't see the kind of that like grower knowledge on it. So we should start that, an encyclopedia on strains. That would be great.
Yeah.
But so it's trial and error, right? I mean, I would err on the side of caution the first time around. And if you flip at 8 inches and you only get up to 20, okay, cool. You've got some room to play with. The next time you've got 4 more inches to play with. Yeah. Right? And so it's kind of just slowly dialing it in, but always at first erring on the side of caution. Yeah.
So it's not just dividing your space in thirds, it's subtracting out the minimum recommended hanging height and from that third.
And if you minus out that recommended hanging height, or what you think you want to be away from that light, then you could break the rest of that into a third. You know? And again, maybe it's only going to have double stretch, right? And so maybe you're going to have plenty of room, and the next time you know that, and now you're utilizing that. You know, and then there's another thing, you know, with Kind, we do have a lot more blue in our spectrum than a lot of companies out there. And so that's going to minimize that stretching phase. You know, especially if you have a light like the X2, where you can actually turn it into a true veg spectrum before switching to a flower spectrum. Those blues are going to minimize that stretching through the first couple weeks of that flowering phase.
It's pretty remarkable how much of a difference it makes.
It really is.
I mean, you do these side by sides, and it's just like I mean, we talked a little bit about that last week, but it's just like it's unbelievable.
Yeah, and that stretch during the flowering stage, I mean, it's similar to what's happening in that plant during that vegetative stage, right?
Yeah.
And so it's like those blues are going to help keep it more compact, keep the internodal spacing tighter. It's going to also lead to, you know, tighter flowering sites as it starts to develop those, which is that internodal spacing per se. But then once you get through those first 2-3 weeks, then you're flipping to that true flower spectrum, and you've got these just nice, tight, compact plants, and so you can minimize that stretching.
So is that stretching coming because the plant's not getting exactly what it wants from the light, so it's reaching closer to it in an effort to...
I mean, stretching can come from all sorts of stuff. Environmental reasons can lead to more stretch, the difference between daytime and nighttime temperatures. And I think we're going to get into that in another episode. It can be certain characteristics in the spectrum. There can be the wrong ratio if the light has a far red or even kind of like more verging on infrared light. If the ratio of the spectrum between the far red and like 660, 680 red is off, it can create what's called shade avoidance response in the plant, and it can actually think it's being shaded, so it's stretching to try to find the light, right? So there's all sorts of stuff that can actually lead to a plant stretching. And so through our spectrums we try to minimize any of the effect that could be coming from the actual light itself.
Right on.
All right, and so now in talking about that vertical space and how much plants stretch, there's one other thing that's going to be taking up that space, and that's going to be either your hydroponic system or your soil pots.
And so, so you really kind of want that soil to take up the minimal amount of space, but if you are too drastic with that, then you're going to impede your plants from reaching their full growth potential.
I mean, your ultimate harvest is going to be a result of how good your root base is, right? Everything about plant structure and yield and quality and everything, it all has to do with the roots. All of it. If you don't have a good root base, you're not going to have a good yield. And so largely that's why we have as a company kind of more heavily relied on hydroponics as a method of growing in small spaces. One, because you can get a fairly compact all-in-one system like the Superponic 8 that we have in the Superbox, or the bigger Superponic 8 that we have in the Superstar, or even the Superponic 16. They're all pretty low profile for the amount of water that they hold and in the space, but you can get it to the point where that whole thing is filled with roots. And so, it's got kind of a deep water culture component to it. It's got a little bit of a top feed component. It's super aerated. And so you can get that thing to the point where it is like one big root mass.
It's pretty crazy.
Inside that
cabinet. They all start to tangle together, and it's just a massive jungle of white roots in there.
And so you've got a lot of root that's doing the job of soaking up that water and that nutrients and feeding the rest of the plant. And so it's a great method for small spaces.
While taking up the least amount of vertical space. Superponics, so named because every superponic system contains 2 or more proven hydroponic methods. So in the case of the Superponic 16, it has automated top feed and deep water culture. And man, do they get great results.
It's super.
It's super.
And so when you're talking about soil, because a lot of people just want to do soil, it's more forgiving than hydroponics is, and some people just kind of like that style. Some people want to do full organic and hydro is a tough thing to do. It is possible, but it is a tough thing to do. And so it's picking a pot that's not too tall. It's got to be shorter and squatter, but at the same time, then you're sacrificing root space. And so it is kind of a dance between how much volume can I get inside that pot, and still have it be kind of a nice, a shorter, more squat container than you would normally use.
Ideal rule of thumb is 2 gallons of soil per 12 inches of plant, right? But you may that may put you in a pot that's too big for a confined space. So you'd have to bring that down a little bit. For the Superstar, I think I was growing in 2-gallon soil pots, and you handed me the 5 gallons and said you should grow 2 5-gallons instead of the 4 2s.
And how did that work for you?
I'm still growing in the 2s, but I'm gonna do the 5s next time.
I'm a little bit offended.
No, it's just I had them.
Those 5 gallons are quite a bit taller than the 2s. I mean by 3 or 4 inches, right? And so you are sacrificing some of that space. You do get more. You do get more roots in a 5-gallon. Another technique that you could try to use is moving over to Coco. Right? I mean, Coco for sure will get you a bigger, more robust root base. It will fill in that pot more than soil will. It's just easier to control, moisture content in Coco. There's more air available throughout that pot. Soil tends to sometimes, pack in some areas. Sometimes it'll get dry pockets that aren't getting fully watered. So, soil can kind of it can be tough to control unless you really have it dialed.
Yeah.
And so cocoa's another a good way to get a really solid root base in a really small pot. In fact, some of the commercial grows that I see that are like, you walk in and it's huge canopies of huge flowers. And then you look down and they're literally growing in 1 gallon pots that are just getting, they're just getting fed, 15, 20 times a day, And
they're not just completely root bound by?
No, not with the speed at which they're growing them. I mean, they're doing probably 1 week of veg and they're flipping them, and that plant is just going, and it's getting everything it needs through those, 15, 20 feeds a day. Yeah. Now, in a small space, you're obviously not going to do 15, 20 feeds a day unless you come up with some kind of really clever, irrigation system, which is totally possible.
Yeah.
But even if you're in, a 2 gallon container and you're doing maybe once, twice a day feeding with cocoa, you're going to get a really good root base and you're going to have a great yield.
So what about just having one giant soil bucket for all of your plants in that space?
You can do that.
Is that something you want to stay away from?
Yeah, I mean, you can do that. And, I think some of the people that do the more living soils, they probably do troughs like that in small spaces. Sometimes you're going to get the dominant plant, because no matter if it comes from seed or from clone, you're always going to get those one clones that just were taken from a better place on mom, and they're just stronger and they just take over.
Cannabis doesn't play nicely with itself.
They can suffocate each other.
You would like to think that it's one big happy family in there, but it's really, that's not the reality. Even with the same strain, it's they're all fighting for that light, they're fighting for the nutrients in the soil, and so it's one definitely
it's a survival.
Wants to take over.
It's survival. Yeah. I mean, this all goes back into the stress training that we talk about, or what you're saying. It's, plants are trying just to make it on to the next generation, which for most living things is the way it is, right? So having a shared container, you're going to get a plant that's kind of overtaking being oh, wow, this is a nice big container. I'm just going to throw out a root base all over this thing. And then it might not suffocate it from a root standpoint, but then it's going to be suffocating it from, I'm growing way faster than you, and now I'm shadowing you and taking you out of the picture. Yeah. So I don't suggest that.
So given that cannabis doesn't always play nicely together in a confined space, I would like to know, because I spoke, I think maybe in the first episode, the second episode, how insanely even your canopies are when you grow. And so corner to corner, everything is exactly the same height. Everybody's seemingly playing very nicely together in harmony. So how do you do that in your grows and get such consistent results time after time?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of factors that go into it. I mean, strain can play a role in it, but largely it's just the practices that I use. One, I make sure that my grow rooms are lit pretty much the exact same from edge to edge, right? We're talking about that flat PPFD mapping. I did a video on that earlier this week, where really, the ultimate goal of a grower and the ultimate grow of us as a grow light company is to design a light that can get you even PPFD coverage from one side of that canopy all the way to the other side. That can be a very challenging thing to do, just because of the nature of light. And as you get towards the edge of the light, less diodes, so there's less overlap. Watch the video if you want to learn more about that. But it's and so having, not overstating your footprint, right? Because that's what a lot of people do. They overstate the footprint. They'll take a light that says it's got a 4x4 footprint and they'll try to squeeze 5x5, 5.5 by 5.5 out of it. And then when you're doing that, what you're creating is areas of the garden that aren't getting as much light, right? And so you naturally will start to see these peaks and valleys in the canopy as those light levels are raising and dipping, right? So even light coverage side to side. Another thing is, I tend to take way more clones than I possibly need so that I can get clones that are rooting around the same time, that are rooting with the same, kind of ferocious, nature, that have similar structure to them, right? So that they all kind of have that beginning point that's relatively the same. You know, if you're only taking 10 clones and you need 10 plants for your space, you're going to have some that root in the first, week, and then some that are going to take to the end of the second week to finally root. And those ones that have been rooted for a while, they're naturally going to grow quicker and faster. So those are going to get taller. They're going to be dominant plants in the garden. So it's making sure that all the plants in the garden have the same kind of dominant structure.
So building your perfect canopy starts at the cloning stage and identifying the characteristics in the plant that you want.
100%. Yeah. 100%. And then as you go along, it starts to get into training techniques, be it low stress training, high stress training, and how, if I have one branch that's really kind of taking off, I'll bend that branch back a little bit and I'll get it into the net trellis, which kind of will slow it down just to the point where all these other ones kind of start to take the lead. And so I'm, constantly kind of adjusting my canopy so that when I'm in full flower and everything has stopped stretching, I just have even canopy across the entire thing. Mm-hmm. And so you can do that in a small space real easy, right?
So maximizing yield in a small space, the stress training is a very integral part of that. You just mentioned low stress training, high stress. What are some examples of the low stress training?
Yeah. And so, and to kind of put it into context, again, what we're describing here is getting the plant canopy, which is, ultimately the top of your plants that are facing the light, that have all of those nice big, flowers sitting at the top, right? That is the area that we need to focus on. And what we want is basically, 1, 2, maybe 3 levels of flowering that is just edge to edge, side of the cabinet to the other side of the cabinet, and just filled with the same size flowers, right? That's what's going to maximize your yield. And again, when we talk about a plant structure, typically plants will grow up. If you didn't do any training to it at all, if you didn't top it at all, didn't do any low stress training or anything, it's going to grow like a Christmas tree, right? It's going to grow one apexal flower that's going to be nice and big and full, and then it's going to grow a bunch of lateral side branches, which are naturally just going to have smaller flowers on them. So when we talk about low stress training, you can take that apex and break that apexal dominance by pulling that to the side, which will naturally tell the plant, hey, these bottom branches need to start growing up. They're now getting full light, so they've got the ability to. And what you're going to do is you're going to pull dominance away and hormones away from that top part of the plant, and you're going to get lateral branching, which is now going to create and can create more lead branches that come up. So now you have bigger tops on more branches. You can do that same thing with topping, which would be considered a high stress training, right? Topping a plant, that's a major thing. It's like you're taking its main stem away, and what it's going to do, it's going to redirect all those hormones to the next branches available, which is typically 2, sometimes 3 branches, right? And so now you're going to have 3 main apex branches that come up.
That are also, when you're doing that, you're also opening up that direct light penetration into the center of the plant, whereas before you would, that primary growth would be blocking that from these layers.
Correct. And then you can also go further with that and top multiple times, right? And now you're taking that apex away. You've got 2 or 3 that are growing up. You're now topping those. Those now have 2 or 3 that come off, right? And you can really start to kind of spread that plant out, which is what you're trying to do in that space. So when we talk about numbers, if you had just a single plant in a small space and you really wanted it to fill out, you would probably want to employ some of these high stress techniques where it's topping multiple times, doing something, like almost like a super cropping, where it's like you're literally snapping those branches in a 90-degree angle and getting that plant to almost start growing on a horizontal plane rather than that vertical plane. And when you do stress technique like that, you're signaling to the plant that something's wrong, right? You're snapping that branch, or bending that branch. I shouldn't say snapping. Snapping would be the branch coming, apart. You don't want that, right? Yeah. But again, it's a stress technique. You're bending that branch. That plant is going, oh crap, something just happened. I need to send extra resources, extra growth hormones to that area. It will actually heal that area that you've now, given stress to. Yeah. And it will also now have a greater buildup of growth hormones in that area to produce heavier flowers. And so by growing horizontally, now you're in control of filling that space that you have filled with, branches that are all getting equal light and all have multiple flowering sites, right? And so you're basically spreading that plant out to maximize from wall to wall that space that you have to grow in.
Yeah, super cropping is crazy. I mean, if you look at it, it looks almost like a mad scientist, because they're tied down so vigorously and ripped, and it's almost like a torture chamber, like with all the stretching and tied down. The way the plants look, it's like some sort of like cruel BDSM, but the plant responds well to it, and it does help maximize yield.
Yeah, and a lot of people, like scrogging is a technique of that, right? Using a net trellis to actually kind of keep just laying things down. And as you lay things down, it will naturally start to grow on that horizontal plane. And every time a lateral branch will come up and start to now become kind of an apex and grow its own, its own flower site.
Which would be more of like a low stress, right? Where you're just actually kind of positioning the plant, impeding its vertical growth with that net trellis or with
correct. You're
twist ties or ropes or
yeah,
whatever.
and you're still encouraging that outward horizontal growth as opposed to that vertical growth. Another way to fill that space would be sea of green. Right? And sea of green is more kind of the technique of, and this for sure has to happen with the right strain, because you're basically flipping it at a very, very young age. You're putting more plants per square foot in that space. So like in the Superstar, right? Superstar is a 2 foot by 2 foot shell, side to side. You'd be putting 1 gallon pots for sure, and you'd probably be putting like 9 of them, right? Or as many as you can fit in that 2 by 2 space. And then you'd be growing them just to a small plant, flipping them, not topping them at all, and letting that one apexal nug come up and grow. And so now you've got 9 big flowers that fill that space. Same thing, right? You're just filling the space with smaller plants, but one nice big top bud.
Like a lollipop? What do you think about lollipopping?
Lollipopping. Yeah.
Don't do it. I don't know too much about it.
Lollipopping, is
it's really like taking everything off. But that primary.
Yeah, it's something that, it can be safely done in the vegetative stage, not within probably a week of throwing into flower, right? Because every time you do that, which is basically, you're leaving you're taking everything but really those top nodes on the branches that you want to keep, right? So a lot of times when we see lollipopping, we'll see maybe, cutting at a young age, topping at a young age, 2 or 3 branches coming up, and you're literally only saving those 2 or 3 branches and the top maybe 2 or 3 nodes on those branches, and stripping the plant of everything else.
With the idea being that it's focusing all its energy on just these 2.
You're basically focusing all energy up to the top of those nodes that you're leaving, right? And so you can do that in early veg, but you probably should wait at least a week after doing something like that to throw it into flower. And then you are using that technique, and we can get into that here in a second, but you're using that technique also probably on day 21 is about what I typically hear people doing it, where they're doing another shedding of all of those leaves to kind of open everything up, get light down into the plant. Because as those flowers grow, they're going to put out a lot more vegetative growth, a lot more, satellite leaves that are going to be able to soak in that light. So you're opening up that canopy and allowing everything that's in there to get an equal amount of light. Some people say that actually steals energy away from the plant, which I can see that argument, right? I mean, each one of those leaves is kind of like like I said, a satellite for taking in photons. And so you're ripping those off the plant, So, but I've seen some amazing yields come from the technique of de-leafing at that 21-day strip. So, the jury's out on that.
It's a thin line to walk. Right, because if there's more light than the plant can photosynthesize with what you've left on it, then it's gonna not elicit the results you're looking for.
And and like disclaimer on any of these things that we're talking about in terms of stress training or de-leafing or anything, it has to happen with a healthy plant.
Yeah.
If you don't have a healthy plant, all of these techniques that we're telling you are going to kill your plant.
Done.
And I've seen it. I've done it. I've de-leafed at the wrong time before, stressed the whole garden out. It ended up finishing 3 weeks early. Everything was tiny and popcorn. Like, it was awful.
Yeah.
And I just wasn't thinking, and I just did it at the wrong time. And they probably weren't as healthy as they could have been. And I failed, And so if you're going to do any stress training, please make sure that you're working with healthy plant first. Then it can take that stress, because I've seen gardens where they do these 21-day strips and it's like not even 2 weeks, 1 week later, you would never even guess they did a strip on it. Everything's back, it's full. It's like, wow. Yeah, it's pretty crazy.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you read up on the topic, it's all super exciting, and you want to try this and you want to try that. But I like, if you're new to doing this and you're just getting started with your grow, the recommendation is to really, take it slow, get familiar with the strain you're growing with, minimize the variables, minimize what you're doing to those plants, concentrate on keeping the roots healthy, the environment right, and just letting that see through to fruition. That's going to be the safest thing. Once you get comfortable with all that, then you can start to add in some of these techniques to see how it influences. Then you can see with your own eyes the impact that it has, right? Like, this is what a normal grow with this strain looks like. This is what a scrog looks like. And then you start trying some of these other techniques that we've talked about, and to see really if it's worth that additional work, that training, and if it's to your preference.
Yeah, and so, so now we've talked about filling the space through these training techniques, getting these flower sites to be wall to wall, because ultimately what we want to see is flower, 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 yep. flower, flower, all the way through, right? Now we need to kind of, once we get into flowering, keep into consideration that we may have overdone it in that stage. And we don't want something that's just massively crowded inside that canopy as we're in those critical weeks of flowering, right? And so getting everything edge to edge is super important, but then making sure that you're keeping enough space for the prime tops that are going to be the biggest. When you start to get that flowering in about, week 3, and you start to see all those flower sites start to develop, and that calyx, production is just starting to just fire everywhere, you're going to see what tops are going to be the biggest and nicest tops. And so you want to make sure that you're kind of going back in after that and using a discretionary view of like, okay, I overdid it. I have too many flower sites in here.
Have to make some tough decisions.
Tough decisions, right? Yeah. Hey, look, I go up to my fruit trees. We planted some fruit trees, which me and my wife have been wanting to do for a really, really long time. Yeah. And every summer you have to walk up to that fruit tree, beautiful peach tree that's just filled with peaches. And it's like, I want to keep every single one of those peaches. And you have to make the tough decision of like thinning that tree out a lot.
Did that with my apple tree.
It's painful. Yeah. It's so painful, and you're throwing these beautiful fruits on the ground, and it's just like, what
especially
am I
when
doing?
It's a new producer,
Yeah, like when the first year you get fruit. Yeah.
I'll tell you. No, our apple tree, every year went through there and kind of took out a lot of the apples because they grow right on top of each other. Didn't do it this year, and they all ripened and they're like this big.
Right, and so that's exactly
last year, big plump. So,
that's exactly what happens with your cannabis flowers or anything that you grow.
That's hard,
right?
Though.
And so going in and evaluating what you've done on that second to third week of flowering and being like, okay, as painful as it is, as nice as everything looks now, it's going to get so much bigger on those other weeks of flowering past week 3, and so you've got to make some decisions, and you got to say, hey, I'm going to take a few of these out. And I'm just going to go in, and it's like, okay, these are, just basically map the whole space and pick the flowers where you're like, I got to keep that one, and just start to thin some of it out.
Got to cut
you
your
can go back
86-man roster.
Yeah, you can go back in later and do a little bit more thinning, but you got to make that decision. You got to make sure that you've got good airflow around each one of those flowers. If you have any big shade leaves at that point that are blocking anything that looks like it's got potential, sure, take it out at that point. But you got to make sure that filling that space doesn't end up biting you in the butt down the road.
It's okay to cry while you do it, and you could also, talk your plant through it as you're taking it out.
And don't take that 3-week-old bud and try to dry it and smoke it. It's it's nothing that you're going to want to smoke.
Just say you're sorry before you do it.
Yeah.
It's for the greater good.
Okay, so one of the things we kind of talked about photo period, and when you switch your plants into flower, but like, what if you're growing in auto? I think is probably a good thing to discuss for small spaces. Auto flowers are obviously not photo period sensitive. They run on maturity or time alive.
Ruderalis.
Ruderalis is what they're crossed with. And so those run on, more traditional, which you see most plants in your garden, they flower after a certain age, no matter what, no matter how much light they're getting.
No photo period.
No matter what.
24 hours a day from start to finish.
Yeah. And so, in choosing an auto flower strain, that can be a whole lot trickier, right?
Yeah, it's interesting because, when it comes to maximizing your yield in a tight space, if you're a beginner, I would say that auto flowers are a great way to do that. But from an expert perspective, I would say it's the exact opposite, right? Because if if you shop for auto flowers, the growth traits, the general attributes of that plant, time to maturation, all of that is kind of in the specs there. So you can kind of gauge like, okay, this is what it's going to do. And, when autoflowers first came out, there was a lot of unpredictability there. It's almost like a good analogy was when LEDs first came out, and it's just like, LEDs, it grows weird. Right?
Nobody took them seriously.
Nobody took them seriously because it wasn't there yet. And that's kind of, my first experience with autoflowers was like that. I was like, oh my God, this is not as advertised. Mm-hmm. But it's come a long way since then. And so you can kind of map out what's going to work well in your space, and then it just kind of does its thing. So if you're not really familiar with growing, and you want to make sure that you get a good harvest in a tight space, autoflowers are a great way to do that. But the problem is that if you're really dialed in and you're trying to maximize that yield in a tight space, you lose a lot of the control that you have as the master grower with sensitive photo period strains. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like you can decide when you want to switch that from veg to flower. You look for those indicators in the plant. You can even apply some of these stress techniques that would kind of make them veg for longer. You don't really have the ability to do that with auto flowers to the same degree.
Yeah, and what we kind of are saying about that is, with a photo period sensitive plant, you determine when you're going to put that thing into flower. If you don't want it to go into flower, it doesn't have to. You could keep that in its vegetative stage for all of time as long as it has 18 hours of light or more. And so if you mess up on, a stress technique and you stress the plant out too much and it looks like it's now kind of like on the downward spiral, you can just keep it in veg and recorrect what you've done to that plant and wait to put it into flower, right? Because once you go into flower, you have to have as much momentum as you possibly can in order to get a really good harvest. And so if you have an auto flower, if you were to do one of those stress training techniques and it went wrong and the plant got overly stressed, you have no control, right? It's gonna still go into flower on day 12 or day 13 or day 14, and you don't have any control over that. So now you're going into flower with a plant that's stressed out, can't take, the momentum has been shot at that point. So you do have a lot less control over an auto flower with what you can do in terms of stress training, in terms of kind of like, what we said with kind of shaping your canopy before you actually enter into flower.
Mm-hmm. Some of the strains have more of a tolerance to it than others, and you're starting to see that a little bit in the description in the specs for autoflowers that they can be stressed to a greater degree or to a less degree, but it's really not in the same not to the same degree that you can with the photo period strains. But again, it is simple. It's like I wouldn't necessarily say I'm maximizing my yield in the tight space, but I'm getting a good yield out of it, and it's very low maintenance and it's predictable. And it, right now it's suiting my needs. So, mm-hmm. So they do have a benefit.
Nice.
Yeah. Okay, but not maximizing. Not maximizing, which is what we're talking
about. For people who really don't know what's possible in a small space, I'd want to tell a small story. which was, we put together our super box, which is, I might screw up these specs, but I think it's 18 by 28 by 32.
By 30.
By 30, okay.
I think. Yeah.
So small box, right? And we did kind of a Frankenstein box. It was just an R&D project that we had where we basically put LED panels on every surface of that box. So 5 different surfaces. The ceiling had LEDs, the sides had LEDs, the front and back had LEDs. I mean, these plants were getting blasted by light from every which direction. We put, I forget what strain it was. It might have been Blue Dream, but we put clones right in that, and we snapped them after about a day or two of just letting them get acclimated and letting the roots kind of take hold in the hydroponic system. And it was the craziest thing I've ever seen in a small space. I mean, it had to have been close to a world record.
When you guys opened it, I was like, holy shit.
Yeah,
like, that is nuts.
Yeah, I mean, when the person that I had harvesting it called it the clown car, because as he was harvesting it, it was just one huge nug branch after another, and they just kept coming and they kept coming. And we didn't turn it into a product simply because there was some downfall to it. Having those LEDs all over, it was really hard to protect the plants from them, and some of the leaves were literally.
We needed some sort of
plexiglass or something. Yeah, the leaves were polka dotted with little burn spots from the LEDs, and so but the point of it was that they were getting from every direction just a massive flood of photons from every which way. And we ended up harvesting 3/4 of a pound out of that space.
30 inches, 30 by 18. I mean, you're talking, it's a cabinet like this.
Yeah, and I kid you not, 3/4 of a pound of dried flower out of that space. I mean, it was like, what?
Yeah.
And I started to calc out, what if you had just a wall of these things built? I mean, it would be a maintenance nightmare from the point of having to open up each one of these little cubes and doing your thing.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's like what you could produce per square foot or cubic foot, I should say, of space was crazy.
We gotta have pictures of that somewhere, right?
We do. I think we have a video of it, of the harvesting of it, which we'll try to post. But it just shows you what's possible in a small space, right? I mean, it's like, this little super box, this non-assuming super box, you can get 3/4 of a pound out of that.
The clown car.
If you have,
I like it.
if you have the right, crazy, R&D project inside of it. And it took, I mean, it wasn't like it was only pulling 100 watts. I mean, there's a lot of wattage going into that little box. So on a per watt standpoint, maybe we weren't breaking any boundaries, but in a per cubic foot standpoint, I think we were.
Yeah.
It was pretty crazy. It was a fun project.
I had all but forgotten about that.
I still have that monster in back. We should fire it back.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah.
Let's put it
Maybe I'll do a grow journal in the clown car box.
in the clown car. Yeah, I'd watch that.
Is there any clown named strains that we could grow in there?
Skittles the clown.
Slappy the clown.
Slappy the tooth decay gummy bear ice cream. I mean, we talked about healthy plants, so nutrients, but I don't know that, optimizing in a tight space, the needs for nutrients really vary at all from what you would find in a space that's unconstrained.
No, I mean, again, small spaces. It's everything else you want to do in a normal room, just on a small scale.
Yep.
The only thing that I would maybe caution with the nutrient side of things is a lot of times when you're kind of just getting going in a small space, you probably are going to be dealing with smaller, less robust root systems, and so if you're really trying to hit some of these upper ECs, you might want to watch that, so you might want to go on the lighter end of a feeding schedule until you start to learn that strain, until you've harvested a couple times and taken out that plant and been like, no, I've got a really solid root base, I'm good there, because you want to make sure that you have that root base developing the way it should in order to take up a really high EC or ppm solution. So I would just say maybe tending on a safer side of the feeding chart.
Nice. So temperatures, environment, we talked a little bit about that, but I mean, what, in a tight space, what is your ideal temperature that you're shooting for?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same as any room, again, on a miniature scale, but just as with the nutrients, I would probably tend on the lower side of an acceptable range, right? So if your acceptable range is 80 to 84, I would tend towards the 80 degree range, just because you're dealing with less cubic feet of space, which means your margin for error is a hell of a lot smaller.
Yeah.
Right? It can heat up that much quicker. It can cool down that much quicker. It's a very small volume of air. In a bigger room, if you have something that is the source of high heat, it's going to take longer to heat that room than it is going to a really small space. So if something goes wrong, God forbid, or whatever it might be, that small space is going to heat up quick. So I think tending towards the lower side of the spectrum is probably a good thing.
Yeah.
But ultimately you're looking for the same variables that you would inside of a big room.
Just a little bit harder to control because any kind of mishap will have a much more dramatic effect.
Yeah.
So controlling humidity in a tight space like that, any recommendations?
I mean, that taking humidity away is never going to be a challenge, right? I mean, moving more air out, unless you live in Florida and the passive air that's being returned into the system is just as humid, if not more. Yeah, it's water. Yeah, exactly. As pure, just 100% humidity. I'm sorry you guys have to live in that climate. Beautiful state, but man, humidity is awful.
You get used to it.
Yeah. I like our dry heat.
Yeah.
And so, taking humidity away is an easier task. Putting humidity back into the air is always a harder task, even in bigger rooms, especially doing it in a way that is equal amongst all of the air in the room. Like, you'll have pockets of very humid air coming right by the humidifier, and then pockets of drier air. You need a lot of airflow to equal that out. So in a small space, fitting a humidifier, probably not going to happen. Can you put a humidifier next to, say, your inlet for air coming back in the room? Yeah, absolutely. And so that's a good way to do it. But again, you're dealing with such a small volume of air in these smaller spaces that you can really overdo it. You can put that humidifier right there, and it is now blasting 100% humidity into that little space, and it rises to 100% humidity in the space like that, right? And so it's like, you just got to know that, with small air volume, the ability to really dial it in and get it exactly perfect is tough. And that's why, in the super closets, the fans that we've spec'd to pull through the carbon filters in those cabinets, and the passive air return that we've spec'd in that cabinet is perfect and ideal for that space. Yeah,
probably a good idea to just in general to monitor a little bit more frequently. I mean, I'll tell you,
and go slow.
I had everything completely dialed in my environment, and because of that, I was a little bit maybe less attentive than I should have been. And change of season, where just like it got hotter outside, caused the garage to get warmer. And I'm just like, no, I got this so dialed, in the span of a week, that was it. Mm-hmm. And I think I called you. I'm like, what happened? You're like, it's too hot.
They got fried.
They got fried. I'm like, no, I've done this like 100 times before. So I was like, but it was like 100 degrees outside last week.
Like,
damn it.
Yeah. So it's constant monitoring, and it's going slow, right? Adjustments are slow. If you're adjusting to pull some of that humidity out, raise your fan speed just a little bit, not a few levels. If you're trying to put moist air back into the grow, put the humidifier maybe slightly away from the inlet valve. If it's not getting in check, right? And monitor. And if it's not getting enough, maybe scoot it a little bit closer. So very incremental changes when you're growing in small spaces. CO2, in small spaces, you have more options with CO2. You can move away from your traditional, tank CO2 burner, right? Those are good for big rooms. And tanks can still be used for small rooms. But you can start moving towards some really cool stuff like the mushroom bags, that for small spaces work great. There's the exhale canisters that also, and all that stuff works basically on fermentation, right? I mean, it's fermentation puts off CO2, and so those things work great for small spaces. They can be pretty inconspicuous and just hang off to the side, like those little mushroom bags. They're nice and flat, and they just kind of hang off to the side. And that can, because it's a small space, it doesn't need a lot of output to keep CO2 levels to a nice,
almost ideal for it.
Yeah. So.
Although it can be pricey in going with those disposable type options, right? I mean, as far as it.
No, I mean some of them. You know, I haven't used them in a long time, and so I'm by no means an expert on them. But I think a lot of those, you know, they have like a 4 to 6 week lifespan. So one of those bags, you hang it in the corner, and you know it does its thing.
Nice.
And so no, I think it's a great option.
Okay, so the last thing that we want to talk about as far as optimizing your yields in a tight space is, of course, talking to your plants and singing to them, right? I mean, that's a very integral part of the process.
Very
like,
important.
You know, daily affirmations, right? Like, big things come in small packages. Big things come in small packages, right? You can do it. And then, is there any particular genre of music that you prefer for large growth?
I think your plants like whatever music you end up liking, right? I mean, to them, it's all vibration.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
It's only the human brain that has taken music and turned it into any kind of like negative context, right?
Yeah.
It's all instruments and vibration and love to them. You
I
know?
like it.
They can't understand words, so if you're saying something that's of negative connotation in the song and the lyrics, they can't understand that. So they just hear the vibration of the instruments and they love it.
And so it's important that you like the music that you're playing to your plants, or they'll pick up on it, and it's not going to maximize your yield in a tight space.
Yeah, I used to hear of people putting Beethoven in the room because they've heard that Beethoven is good for plant growth. And I'm like, do you like Beethoven? No, not really. Well, then why would your plants? And I have nothing like Beethoven.
I like Beethoven.
Beethoven's great. He's beautiful.
Shares a birthday with me.
Hey, fun fact.
Yeah. December 16th.
So, you know, but yeah, but it is true, right? Plants are living things. You want to interact with them. Not only are you giving off CO2, which they love, right?
Ah, yeah.
Which is when you talk to a plant, when you sing
full
to
of
a
that
plant.
shit.
Yeah, it's like that's what you're imparting on them is a lot of CO2, which they love. And it's every living thing should love interaction, right? That's what we're all based on. We're energy, we attract each other.
Energy.
And so, you know, loving your plants are super important.
It
And
helps.
through loving your plants and singing to them, naturally what's going to happen is you're going to be paying attention to them at that moment, right?
Even if you're tone deaf, does it still help?
Yes, they don't know that.
Oh, see?
They're non-judgmental, unlike human beings.
All right.
I want to see science on this.
Yeah, okay. Oh, no, we could.
This is bro.
What plant is the most judgmental of all plants in the
Simonus cowlus.
So, you know, so that's you know, that's kind of what it boils down to is paying attention to your plants. Noticing if you see something where it looks like, oh, that's maybe damage from a bug.
Yeah.
Oh, look, it's got a little spot of, you know, white, possibly powdery mildew. And so I do think that singing to your plants or talking to your plants, just spending time with your plants is ultimately a healthy thing.
Prove us wrong. You can't.
Yeah, and that's the whole problem with automation these days. It's just we're losing touch with each other. We're losing touch with the plants.
Yeah.
We're losing touch with nature.
Nobody likes solitary confinement.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Which a small space can feel like.
Yeah.
Unless you have visitors.
But you got your buddies, but as we already discussed, they don't play nice. There can be only one.
Anyway, I think we've actually run out of time to do this
it's
standing
time to
in
end
front
this
of the
thing.
room, so we'll save that for another episode.
Yeah.
You know, like always, you know, subscribe, hit the like button if you like what you've heard here, share it with as many friends as you possibly can, especially if they want to start growing in small spaces and haven't done it before. I think they'll find a lot of what we just said to be useful information.
Thanks for joining us for this episode. We hope you got some nice takeaways from it. As always, Nick, nice spending the past hour and 15 minutes with you.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
All right.
See you next time.
Yeah, have a good one.
Take care, everybody.